Elara Vance had always found solace in silence. Growing up in the sprawling, Gothic Vance Manor, nestled in the fog-laced hills of Vermont, she was the ghost child, the one who preferred the company of wilting orchids in the greenhouse to the sharp-tongued debates of her family's dinner table. Her father, Arthur Vance, was a titan of industry, a man who built a shipping empire from a single rusty trawler. Her mother, Celeste, was a brittle socialite whose love was a currency dispensed only for achievements that glittered. Alara's older brother, Julian, was the golden child, charming, ruthless, and a perfect reflection of their parents' ambition. Alara's passion, her only rebellion, was botany, not the pristine, ordered kind found in textbooks, but the wild, tenacious kind. She loved the plants that thrived in the cracks of pavements, the poisonous berries that glowed like jewels in the autumn undergrowth, the aggressive ivy that could crumble a wall over a century. At 25, she had just returned from a 2-year research expedition in the Amazon, funded by a grant her father had reluctantly signed off on, more to get her out of the way than out of any belief in her work. The day after her return, her father summoned her to his study. It was a room of dark wood and the ghosts of dead animals, their glass eyes staring from the walls. Julian was already there, lounging in a leather chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. Arthur didn't ask her to sit. "Elara," he began, his voice gravelly with decades of cigars and commands. "Your expedition is over. It's time we discussed your future. Your place in this family." "I have a place," Elara said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "I have a research fellowship waiting for me at the New York Botanical Garden. I leave next month." Celeste, who had been silently observing from the doorway, let out a delicate, humorless laugh. "A fellowship? The stipend is barely enough for a studio apartment in Brooklyn. That's not a life, darling. That's a hobby." Julian leaned forward, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "What Mother is trying to say is that we have a more fitting proposition for you. Father's health isn't what it used to be. We're restructuring. The company needs liquid assets." Arthur cut in, his voice final. "The manor is a millstone. We're selling it. A developer is interested in the land. But there's a clause in my father's will, your grandfather's will. The estate, the physical property of Vance Manor and its grounds, is held in a trust that splits ownership between my 3 children." Elara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. 3? There's only Julian and me." "No," Julian said, savoring the word. "There's also the estate itself, the property. According to the archaic terms of the trust, the land is considered a 3rd child. Any decision to sell requires a unanimous vote. You, me, and the manor." "That's absurd," Elara whispered. "Which is why," Arthur continued, ignoring her, "we've found a way around it. If one of the living children relinquishes their claim, their share is absorbed by the other living sibling, not the property. Julian can buy you out, a clean sum, enough for your little plants in New York for a few years. You sign the papers, and you walk away." The sum he named was insulting, a fraction of what the land was worth. It was a bribe to disappear. Elara looked at her family, the cold ambition in her father's eyes, the disdainful pity on her mother's face, the triumphant glint in Julian's. They weren't offering her a future, they were evicting her from her own history. "No," she said. The word was a small pebble dropped into a vast, silent ocean, but it rippled. The silence that followed was deadly. Julian's smile vanished. Arthur's face purpled. Celeste looked at her as if she'd just sprouted a second head. "No," Julian repeated, standing up. You think you can live here, run this mausoleum on your fellowship salary? The taxes alone will eat you alive. I'll manage, Elara said, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice miraculously clear. Grandfather left the manor to all of us. I won't be party to destroying it for your quick profit. The argument that followed was a maelstrom of fury and manipulation. They threatened to cut her off entirely, to contest her sanity, to make her life so miserable she'd beg to leave. Elara, rooted to the spot, absorbed it all, like a plant absorbing poison. When they finally ran out of words, she simply turned and walked out, back to the solace of the overgrown greenhouse. What she didn't know, as she fell asleep that night to the sound of wind rattling the old panes, was that her family's cruelty was just beginning, and that its first blow would strike at the very core of who she was. The following weeks were a war of attrition. Julienne and her parents employed a strategy of cold neglect, hoping to freeze her out. The household staff, long loyal to Arthur, began to treat Elara as an interloper. Meals were no longer announced for her. Her requests for supplies for the greenhouse were ignored. But Elara was resilient. She had lived on less in the rainforest. She began foraging for food in the manor's own wild gardens, repairing the old greenhouse boilers herself, and existing in a parallel universe to her family. The real blow came without warning. It was a Tuesday. Elara was in town, picking up supplies with the last of her meager savings, when a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred at the edges, and a searing pain lanced through her chest, stealing her breath. She clutched a lamppost, gasping, as the world swam around her. A kind stranger drove her to the small local hospital. The emergency room was a flurry of activity. Doctors ran EKGs, took blood, and asked questions she could barely answer through the pain. Finally, a serious-faced cardiologist came to her bedside. "Miss Vance," he said gently, "you have a severe congenital heart defect, an atrial septal defect, essentially a hole in the wall of your heart. It's likely been there since birth, but the strain of your recent activities, the altitude changes, the physical exertion in the Amazon, has exacerbated it critically. You need surgery. Soon, within the week. We can stabilize you here, but the operation needs to be done at a specialist center in Boston." Surgery. The word hung in the sterile air, cold and terrifying. Her mind raced, not with fear of the knife, but with the immediate, practical nightmare of it all. The cost, the logistics. She had no insurance that her parents hadn't controlled. Her small savings were already gone. With a trembling hand, she borrowed a nurse's phone and called the manor. The line was cold and unfeeling. She asked for her father. He was in a meeting. Her mother? Unavailable. Julian? She was put through to his voicemail. Her voice cracked as she left a message, explaining the diagnosis, the urgency, the need for help. Hours passed. No callback. She tried again. This time she got through to her mother's personal assistant. "I'm sorry, Miss Vance. Mrs. Vance is preparing for a charity gala this evening and cannot be disturbed. I will pass on your message." The gala. Her daughter was in a hospital bed with a failing heart, and her mother was picking out a dress for a party. That evening, a doctor came in with a sympathetic look. "Miss Vance, we've had a call from your family's legal representative. He's sent over some paperwork and, well, he's rescinded the insurance authorization. He said that as you are no longer considered a dependent residing in the family home, you are responsible for your own medical expenses. He also wanted us to give you this." He handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a letter from Julian, written in his arrogant, looping script. Elara. Father is furious you're dragging the family name through the mud at a public hospital. This little stunt won't work. We know you're not really sick. It's a desperate play for sympathy to get us to change our minds about the manner. It's pathetic. We're not paying for a single stitch. If you want to play independence, then play it fully. Sign the relinquishment papers, and we'll cover the surgery. Otherwise, you're on your own. I've always said you were soft. Prove me wrong. J. The letter fell from her numb fingers. She wasn't just being ignored, she was being accused of faking a life-threatening condition to manipulate them. The cruelty was so profound, so absolute, it took the very air from her lungs. The pain in her chest intensified, not from the defect, but from the sheer, crushing weight of their indifference. The hospital social worker was kind but firm. Without insurance or a massive upfront payment, they couldn't perform the surgery. They could only provide stabilizing medication. They gave her the number for state aid, for charities, for anything. But the clock was ticking. Her heart was literally breaking. Discharged with a bag of beta blockers and a list of phone numbers, Elara took a bus back to the town nearest the manor. She didn't go to the house. She couldn't face them. Instead, she walked to the only place that had ever felt like home, the greenhouse. It was cold and dark. She sat on the damp earth, surrounded by her dormant plants, and for the first time in her life, Elara Vance allowed herself to weep. Not from self-pity, but from a profound, bone-deep grief for the family she never truly had. In that moment, surrounded by the silent, patient life in the soil, a different kind of seed was planted in her heart, a seed of resolve, hard and dark as a stone. She would not prove them right by dying. She would find a way to live, and she would do it without them. The path to survival was not paved with charity or state aid. It was paved with thorns. With the last of her cash, Elara bought bus ticket to a place she'd only ever read about in dry academic journals, the Appalachian School of Botanical Medicine in the hills of West Virginia. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had a plan, born of a clarity that only comes when you have nothing left to lose. She arrived at the school, a collection of rustic buildings nestled in a misty hollow, frail and pale. She begged for an audience with the head of the school, an old woman named Dr. Isla Finch, who looked at her not with pity, but with sharp, assessing eyes. Elara told her everything, her research in the Amazon, her encyclopedic knowledge of flora, and her current, desperate situation. She didn't ask for charity. She proposed a trade. "I will work," Elara said, her voice a thin thread of steel. "I'll work day and night. I'll catalog your entire herbarium. I'll tend your most difficult specimens. I'll teach introductory classes. In exchange, I need a place to live, food, and I need you to let me study your apothecary. I need to understand the plants that can help a broken heart." Dr. Finch was silent for a long time. Then she leaned forward. "We have a scholarship fund for promising students of ethnobotany. It's competitive, but it requires a thesis, a contribution to the field." She gestured to a bookcase filled with leather-bound journals. "My own thesis was on the use of digitalis purpurea, foxglove, by Appalachian healers to treat dropsy, a condition of fluid retention that we now know is often a symptom of heart failure. The plant gives us digitalis, a drug that can strengthen the heartbeat, but it's a poison too. The line between remedy and toxin is simply a matter of dose and understanding." For the first time in weeks, a spark of something other than pain flickered in Elara's chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was fascination. The very plants she loved held the key to healing and harm. Her family had tried to poison her life. Perhaps the natural world held the antidote. The next 2 years were a brutal, beautiful metamorphosis. She lived in a tiny, unheated cabin. She worked from dawn until dusk. Her knowledge, already vast, deepened into wisdom. She learned to prepare tinctures and salves, to understand the subtle chemistry of bark and root and berry. And she learned about her own condition. She didn't just take the conventional medications the school's doctor prescribed, she studied them. She learned how they worked, and how certain plants, like hawthornberry and motherwort, could support and strengthen cardiac function. The physical work was agony at first. Her weakened heart would pound, and she would have to stop and rest, her face pale. But slowly, incrementally, the combination of conventional medicine, herbal support, and the simple, clean life began to work. The hole in her heart was still there, a permanent flaw, but the muscle around it grew stronger, learning to compensate. Her body, like her spirit, was adapting, thriving in the cracks. During this time, the outside world ceased to exist. She never contacted her family. She assumed they had sold the manor and were living their glittering lives, having successfully erased her. She was fine with that. She was building something new. In her 3rd year, she completed her thesis, The Cardiac Glycosides of the Temperate Forest, a comparative study of efficacy and toxicity in digitalis and opossum. It was groundbreaking. Dr. Finch, with tears in her eyes, presented it to a board of reviewers. It was published, and it caused a ripple in the small world of ethnobotany. Offers for speaking engagements, research positions, and fellowships began to trickle in. But Elara had one more project. In the hills, she had found her peace, but she hadn't found her purpose. One evening, sitting on her porch, watching fireflies dance in the dusk, she realized what it was. She would go back. Not to the manor, not to her family, but to the place where it all began. She would reclaim the overgrown land of her childhood, not as a home, but as a living laboratory. She would create a sanctuary for rare and medicinal plants, a place of healing born from the very ground that had witnessed her greatest pain. Using the small advance from her thesis publication and a grant from a botanical conservation society, she bought a small, neglected plot of land adjacent to the Vance Manor property, a piece of land her family had never bothered to acquire. It was rocky, steep, and considered useless. To Elara, it was perfect. It was the beginning of her inheritance of thorns. 5 years after she had left the hospital, broken and alone, Elara Vance stood on a hill overlooking her creation. The Thorn and Bloom Sanctuary was no longer just a dream. What had been a scrubby, worthless hillside was now a terraced marvel of biodiversity. Rare orchids from the temperate zone clung to life in a custom-built cloud house. A poison garden, fenced off and clearly labeled, showcased the deadly beauty of nightshade, monkshood, and hemlock, drawing fascinated botanists and students. The centerpiece was a state-of-the-art research facility, funded by grants and private donations, dedicated to the study of medicinal plants and cardiac health. Elara, now 32, was its director. Her heart condition was a manageable part of her life, monitored but no longer defining her. Her sanctuary had become a renowned destination, a place where science and nature intertwined. Local news had done stories on it, and it had put the small Vermont town back on the map. Elara lived in a simple, modern house she'd built on the property, a world away from the gloomy Vance Manor, which she could just see in the distance, its grand facade looking tired and forlorn. She thought of her family rarely now, and with a detached indifference that surprised even her. The pain had been processed, like a compost heap, and from it, rich soil had grown. Then, one frigid November evening, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a sight so incongruous it didn't register at first. 3 figures huddled on her doorstep, shivering in coats that looked expensive but were clearly inadequate for the weather. It was her mother, Celeste, gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hair a brittle, unwashed gray. Behind her stood Julian, his once handsome face bloated and etched with deep lines of strain. Leaning on Julian, looking impossibly old and diminished, was her father, Arthur. They stared at her, this woman they had tried to erase. She was lean and strong, her skin tanned from working outdoors, her eyes clear and calm. She wore a simple wool sweater and work trousers. She was a stranger to them. Elara, her mother whispered, the name falling from her lips like a foreign word. "What do you want?" Elara asked. Her voice was not cold, but it held no warmth. It was the voice one might use to inquire about the weather. Julian stepped forward, attempting a ghost of his old charm. "Elara, we need your help. Things have gone badly." They spilled the story in a rushed, pathetic tumble of words. The shipping empire had crumbled under the weight of Julian's reckless investments and a global recession. Arthur's health had failed. The manor, heavily mortgaged, was in foreclosure. They were being evicted. They had nowhere to go. They had seen the news stories about her. They knew she had money, land, a house. They had come to beg. "We just need a place to stay," Celeste pleaded, her eyes darting around Elara's warm, inviting home. "Just for a little while, until we get back on our feet. We're family." Family. The word hung in the air, a toxic echo of the past. Elara looked at them. These 3 people who had once held all the power, who had tried to crush her with their indifference. She felt no surge of triumphant anger, no desire for revenge. She simply felt nothing. The connection had been severed so long ago, the wound had healed over, leaving only scar tissue. "No," she said. It was the same word she had spoken in her father's study 5 years ago, but now it was not a pebble in a pond, it was a stone wall. Julian's face crumpled into anger. "You can't just leave us out here. We'll freeze. Is this your revenge? Is this what your precious plants taught you? Cruelty?" Elara looked past them, towards the distant, dark shape of the manor. "My plants taught me about cycles," she said quietly, "about how things grow and how things decay. They taught me that you cannot force a bloom from a poisoned root. You came to my door once before, in a way, 5 years ago. You sent a letter instead. It said I was on my own. I was, and I survived. I learned. I grew. You are now on your own." She stepped back and began to close the door. "Wait," Arthur croaked, his voice a ruined whisper. "Please, for your mother, for me." Elara paused. She looked at him, the Titan now a trembling old man. "You taught me everything I know about family, Father," she said. "You taught me that it's conditional, a transaction. I have nothing left to trade." The door closed with a soft, final click. Through the thick, insulated glass of her door, Elara watched them for a long moment. Julian was shouting, his fists clenched, his breath misting in the cold air. Celeste was crying, her body shaking. Arthur just stood there, a statue of ruin. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they turned and stumbled away down the dark drive, back towards the road, towards the town, towards whatever fate awaited them. Elara let out a long, slow breath. It was done. The last thread, frayed and meaningless, had been cut. She did not see them again. She heard, through the town's grapevine, that a distant cousin had taken them in, that Julian had taken a job selling cars, that her parents lived in a small apartment, their lives a shadow of their former grandeur. The news arrived and left no mark on her. Her world was here, in the quiet hum of the grow lights, the rustle of leaves in the greenhouse, the focused faces of students in her lectures. Years passed. The Thorn and Bloom Sanctuary grew in reputation and size. Elara became a respected, if somewhat enigmatic, figure in the world of botanical science. She published papers, spoke at conferences, and mentored a new generation of ethnobotanists who shared her passion for the healing power of plants. She never married, but her life was full of a different kind of family: her dedicated staff, her brilliant students, and the silent, thriving community of flora she had nurtured back from the edge. One spring morning, a young woman appeared at the sanctuary's visitor center. She was perhaps 22, with nervous hands and curious, intelligent eyes. She asked to speak with the director. When Elara met her in her office, surrounded by pressed specimens and botanical texts, the young woman introduced herself. "My name is Lily," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Lily Vance. I'm Julian's daughter." The name hit Elara like a physical blow. She had never known Julian had a child. She gestured for her to sit, her own heart, the old, steady, reliable muscle, giving a strange, unfamiliar flutter. Lily explained. Her father had never spoken of Elara, but she had found old letters, photographs, and a cutting from a newspaper article about the sanctuary. She had pieced together the story, or at least the outline of it. She was studying environmental science in college, and she was fascinated by Elara's work on cardiac glycosides. She had come, she said, not to ask for anything, but to learn, and maybe, if it was possible, to know the aunt she had never met. Elara listened in silence. She saw the ghost of Julian in the shape of Lily's face, the shadow of her mother in her mannerisms, but she also saw something else, a spark of genuine passion, a thirst for knowledge that was entirely her own. The sins of the father, Elara knew from years of studying the natural world, were not always visited upon the children. Poison ivy's offspring was just more poison ivy, but a human child could choose a different path. She didn't offer instant forgiveness or a tearful family reunion. That wasn't who she was. But she did offer something else. She offered Lily an internship for the summer, a chance to work in the gardens, to study in the library, to prove herself. It was not an inheritance of money or land, but an inheritance of a different kind, a legacy of knowledge, of resilience, of finding life in the most unlikely places. That summer, Elara would often see Lily working among the raised beds, her hands in the soil, her face tilted towards the sun. The girl was a hard worker, quick to learn, and respectful of the plants she tended. She didn't push for a personal connection, and Elara didn't offer one easily, but slowly a bond began to form, not of familial obligation, but of shared purpose. On the last day of the internship, as the golden light of late summer slanted across the hills, Lily came to find Elara in the poison garden. She was carefully deadheading the spent blooms of the foxglove, saving the seeds for next year's planting. "I wanted to thank you," Lily said quietly. "This has been the best summer of my life. I understand now why you love this place." She hesitated. "I also wanted to say, I'm sorry for what my father and grandparents did to you. I know it's not mine to apologize for, but I'm sorry anyway." Elara straightened up, a seed head in her palm. She looked at the tall spires of the foxgloves, their bell-shaped flowers a delicate purple. Beautiful, deadly, healing, all at once, just like family, just like life. "Thank you, Lily," she said, and her voice was softer than it had been in years. The foxglove has a lesson. It holds the power to stop a heart or to strengthen it. It all depends on how you use it. You've chosen to use your heritage well. She handed the seed head to Lily. "Here, plant these in your own garden someday. They're not easy to grow. They need patience and the right conditions, and they don't always bloom the first year. But when they do, they're extraordinary." Lily took the seeds, her eyes shining with something more than just gratitude. It was the beginning of a new story, one not defined by the poison of the past, but by the potential of the future. As Elara watched her walk away, she turned back to her garden. The air was cool and clean. The plants rustled in the breeze, a quiet, contented sound. She had spent years building a sanctuary for threatened species. She hadn't realized, until now, that she had also been building one for herself. The inheritance of thorns, in the end, had bloomed into something far more precious than any fortune. It had bloomed into a life of her own making. If this story of resilience, betrayal, and the healing power of nature touched you, here's how you can get more. Love dramatic stories? Join the family. Subscribe to the channel for a new gripping story every week. Which character did you connect with most? Elara's strength, Lily's curiosity, or the symbolic power of the garden? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, smash that like button. It helps more people discover tales of justice and transformation. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that even from the darkest soil, something beautiful can grow.